Grant us your Spirit, Lord, as we reflect on your word, for Jesus' sake. Amen. Sit. Take a moment reflecting on the nature of faith and life. There's something about Aidan who was known for his generosity, for his giving to others in simplicity. And Sunday we were thinking a little bit about prayer and how it's rooted in the generosity of God, how God is involved in all people and all places, and the God who is generous in giving. I suppose Aidan reminds us that if in prayer we're aware of the God who is generous and who gives to us, then we end up being generous to others. Not so much because we ought to, although sometimes that's part of it, but because it's natural, we're in contact with God. You know, some of that is the generosity seen for those in far-flung places and charities and all the work that's going on at the minute, trying to do something in Afghanistan, trying to meet the needs of our own country, aware of the pandemic and its effects. There's something of the generosity that's so important. And prayer is linked to it because it's a generous heart that keeps giving. And perhaps this last year has stretched us all to the point at which it becomes harder to keep being generous and keep giving because we feel we've given so much and we're just keeping going. Prayer renews our life and our strength in God. And in Isaiah it speaks of the God who comes to the whole earth, the God who sent forth in righteousness a word that keeps going. I suppose that's what Aidan was doing in responding to the call to come to England. Perhaps in those terms it was sometimes described as a rather barbarous land of kings who kind of slaughtered one another and took power, and then the poor ordinary people just heads down and carry on. But Aidan responded. There was something for him of the God who's generous, who doesn't give up on this world, that had fired him up to keep going and to keep giving. He obviously made an impact on the king of that time, Oswald. There's a story told of Aidan how the king, after a while, saw just the impact and thought, well, Aidan, you're walking everywhere. You know, you're having to walk from village to village to village, and it's a big area. This is the biggest kingdom. So he thought, I know, I'll give him a generous gift. I'll give him a horse, all ready equipped, this grand horse. And Aidan sat on this horse and went to the next village and met a beggar on the street. And of course, got down off the horse and was wishing the beggar well and speaking to him about, still being loved and God's care. But then, of course, realised that he had this huge horse behind him and thought, well, how can there be people in this world who are struggling and me have this big horse? So he then took the reins and handed it to the beggar and said, you take the horse. I think you need it more than me. And blessed him and off went on his way. And of course the king was rather furious that, this huge gift had been given to someone who may or may not have been able to take care of it or benefit, other than probably sell it on to someone who could. But I think Aidan is quoted as saying, well, if you value this horse born of a mare, how can you not value the child of God who's there in front of us? There's something about Aidan which, those kind of stories, like the Bible stories, they make us think, don't they? What have we got? How are we generous? Because Linda's farm was a place of prayer, so that Aidan went out, but it kept coming back to be renewed in prayer, renewed in that place, that monastery that slowly developed, a place of prayer that attunes Aidan to God's love and God's generosity. The centre of prayer was needed, probably to keep him refreshed, so that when he met people like that, he knew how to respond well. Libby and I have visited Linda's farm on a number of occasions. It's an amazing place. I don't know if you've been, but it's a tidal place. So the tide comes and then goes. So you're cut off from everyone else for part of the day. And if you're staying on the island, then you have the wonder that all the tourists flock in, and there are thousands upon thousands of them. But once the tide has come in and cut people off, most people got out. So you're then left with an island that is much quieter with the islanders there. And I think it was one of the first times we went, we thought, once everyone had gone, we thought we'll go for a walk. But of course this is the northeast of England, and therefore it's not always sunny and nice and beautiful. When we think of a place of prayer, we think, oh, it's a lovely, sunsets and quietness and peace. And it was, but that evening I went for a walk and the wind blew up and suddenly there was a shower. And you see the waves kind of pounding and the poor seals taking refuge. And it felt like we came back rather blown around. And we kind of thought, oh, this is not quite what we expected. But as I reflected on it, I thought, actually sometimes life gives us the things that do knock us around. There was a sense of, being honest about that, but also a sense of being cleansed. God cleanses us sometimes by, giving us a very fresh dose of a storm. And I reflected, yes, it's even in those things there's God at work, and sometimes it's the attitude. You're thinking, well, Lord, you've blown us around, you've freshened us up, but knocked us around a bit, which helped then, approach others when we came back from that break and thinking, yeah, there are others who maybe not been to the same place, but also life blows them around a bit. And somehow our calling in generosity is to be the people who are still generous when people have lost what holds them firm. I think that's part of what we do in talking with others, part of what we do in prayer, is having that sort of firm base on which to reach out in generosity, knowing that others like ourselves get knocked around. I think there's something about Aidan which is always inspiring as a person of deep prayer, but a person who served others with a generosity that came from that prayer and knowledge of God. And maybe as we continue, whatever the months ahead have in store for them, we can go ahead with that knowledge of God's deep love for you and for me, and that encouragement to keep being generous in the small ways or the big ways that we have. A smile, a word of encouragement, sometimes just noticing the people who are not otherwise noticed, as Aidan did. Small ways that speak of God's great care and love. So, loving Jesus, help us to reflect Aidan. Help us to reflect those we know who are so much more generous in heart than ourselves. Continue to stir us in prayer and give us opportunity to share with others this coming week. Through Jesus Christ our Lord.